A lot of these stories I read, I don't really read beforehand. Like, I won't go through it and see what the story's about. Sometimes I'll do like a quick summary. I'll see who wrote it, and if it's an author that I really like that I've used on the channel many times before, like Red Tyrant Nova or Shadow Swimmer, or the multitude of other narrator or authors that I've used, then I'll just read their story. And I tend to do that a lot. But the other night I started reading a story, got about 30 minutes into it, and I probably had another 30 or 45 minutes to go. Probably would have ended up being an hour-long story approximately after editing and all that other stuff. I'm just sitting there, I'm like, this is garbage. And I completely just lost any ambition to finish it. So, A.K. McCarthy came through with another story this week. He's part of Team CGS. Let's see what he's got for us. The playground in the mall. I'm probably not gonna title this video that. I watched an ant scramble across a plate on my sister's dining room table. It stopped to consider a moldy crumb and moved on. My sister Morgan had always been so neat and tidy, at least until the past few weeks. Now her place was too messy for even a bug to enjoy it. I'm not taking the job, I said. I just wanted to tell you about it, and, well, I thought you should know. She sat on the other side of the table, eyes vacant and face slack. Her body was there, but her mind was elsewhere. That was starting to be the norm. I decided to tidy up her apartment. Cleaning up for people was my day job, after all. I stacked plates and bowls and started to carry them to the kitchen. As I passed my sister, she lashed out and grabbed my wrist. The bowls teetered, but I was able to keep them balanced. "Do it," Morgan said, her voice dark and hard. "You should go in there and clean up what that man did." She let her arm fall back to her lap. I kept walking to the kitchen and started doing the dishes. I thought about what she said. I'd been thinking about this job all afternoon and evening. Hell no, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to go into that mall and see what that man had done in there. I didn't want to know where he took those kids, where he took Angela, my niece, Morgan's daughter. Angela had been missing for 2 weeks when the cops finally got a tip that a man, Irwin B. Tolliver, was taking children into the abandoned Asherton Mall. When they went inside, the police found that Tolliver had built an entire playground out of stolen equipment and items he had purchased online. Angela was there, along with a dozen or so other kids. They were all sick, having eaten only candy and cake and soda for weeks. Many of them were tied to the playground equipment, forced to play night and day. And somehow Tolliver had figured out how to get the sound system in the mall working. The speakers were playing children's music on a loop. Tolliver, well, I'll spare you the details, but he didn't let the cops take him alive. So that was one last exclamation point on the lifelong trauma he inflicted on those poor kids. The children were nearly comatose. They stared off into space all day, refusing to speak or eat or walk around. Angela had only whispered one word for weeks. Playtime. The whole thing made me sick. It sent Morgan's husband, Stu, over the edge, and Morgan was barely hanging on. Stu was almost as catatonic as Angela was. He barely left his bed. At least Morgan was with it enough to order food and take Angela to her therapy sessions. I came over a couple of nights a week to clean and provide some light social interaction, but most of our nights were like this, with me saying a few things and the three of them staring at the television or out of the window. The cleaning company I work for often gets tasked with helping the police department clean up crime scenes. This is a small town and an understaffed police force, so they need our help sometimes. I've seen and mopped up things that I could have never imagined, but none of it really bothered me that much. Every job is turning a mess into a clean room, whether it's after a flood, or after a rat infestation, or after a murder. But when my boss called me into his office and talked about the Ashterton Mall job, I immediately knew that I wouldn't be able to handle that scene. My boss, Frank, was a nice guy, and he called that one-on-one meeting because he knew about my connection to the crime. He said that he wouldn't penalize me for not wanting to show up for this gig. I told him that there was no way I was setting foot in that mall, and that was that. As I washed dishes in Morgan's kitchen, though, I thought about what she said. Clean up what that man did. And I looked over at Morgan, who was still sitting at the dining room table staring into the dark living room. Maybe I could clean this up. For all of us. 2 days later, we pulled the van into the empty parking lot at the Ashterton Mall. As the tires rumbled over the cracked surface, I stared at the imposing building. Years of dirt and weather had stenciled Kohl's and J.C. Penney on the side of the building so clearly that you could still read them, even though the signs were gone. The mall was taller as we approached, looking more like a tidal wave than a building. The van rumbled to a halt just outside the former entrance to Kohl's. My boss, Frank, turned the engine off, and the four of us sat in the van for a few moments. Nobody moved. We were all trying to prepare ourselves for the scene that we were about to see. "Kyle," Frank said, looking at me in the rearview mirror. "You know, if you want to stay out here, I just want to let you know again that we don't blame you. You don't have to go in there with us." I put my hand on the door handle and pulled. "Yes, I do," I said. The four of us walked up to the door and Frank got the keys out. We always checked out a cleanup site before we started unloading our equipment. We only wanted to bring what we needed. For this, we knew we were going to be hauling out a ton of junk, so we scheduled a truck to come help us haul it out. But for the time being, it was just the four of us. Frank fumbled with the keys a little bit, but eventually got the right key in the lock. He twisted it, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The other guys let me go first. They avoided eye contact as I walked past them into the mall. Kohl's was pretty much empty. It was odd to see the familiar bones of a shop in the mall without any merchandise or furniture in it. It was all plain white columns and plain white walls and cream-colored tiles. Not all the tiles were still cream-colored, though. There was a path from the door through the store and into the mall's atrium. The path was well-traveled, clearly used to drag heavy items. There were black scuff marks and cracks in the tiles from the weight of the equipment. We followed the path like a cursed version of the yellow brick road, and I wondered if Angela had walked this same path, or if Tolliver had carried or dragged her along it. I caught a glimpse of the playground before we got to the atrium. Natural light flooded the place, glinting off a gray metal slide. I saw one side of a teeter-totter as well, and we all started walking slower when the playground came into view, like we wanted to stay far away from it forever. Eventually, the four of us emerged from Kohl's into the bright atrium. The slide was taller than I expected. It was dented and bent, either from years of use or from Tolliver dragging it into the mall. I looked at all the dents near the top of the slide and felt sick when I realized that they were roughly the size of small fists. Each side of the teeter-totter had a seat on it with leather straps. The straps were fitted with padlocks. The leather was ripped and torn, and as I got closer I saw that the straps were stained with blood, like the kids had picked at these restraints so hard that their fingers bled. Most of the equipment was like this. There were restraints of all kinds, from straps to handcuffs to harnesses. I tried to remember if Angela had any physical injuries. Morgan and Stu hadn't told me much, and I hadn't felt comfortable prying. I had talked to Angela a few times, but was mostly focused on her sallow cheeks and sunken eyes. And all her chapped lips could manage to say was, "Playtime." Angela had lost so much of herself here in this atrium. All of those kids had. I could almost feel them around me like gusts of wind trapped indoors and circulating without end. Their childhoods were effectively over, I thought to myself. How could you ever be carefree or happy again after something like this? Anger and sorrow were indistinguishable within me. I wanted to rip the playground equipment apart, but part of me thought it should remain standing as a reminder to everyone of how evil a person can be. One of the other cleaners, Toby, turned away. I saw his shoulders shake with sobs. The fourth cleaner, Annabelle, stood alongside Frank, who shook his head as he looked at the monkey bars. He spoke quietly, but I could still hear him from a few feet away. If he hadn't offed himself, this guy would have been a field day for psychologists, Frank said. Could you just imagine what was going on in this sick fuck's head? You know, they found a manifesto, Annabelle said. Didn't you hear? He thought more kids needed to play instead of spending all their time on phones and computers. He made a place where kids could come and play without any distractions, during any season. Frank's face was splotchy by the time Annabelle finished talking. He looked like he was about to scream and cry and throw up all at once. He sniffed and cleared his throat. He spoke loudly enough that his words echoed around the atrium. All right, everyone. I know this is hard to stomach, but the sooner we get to work, the sooner we could rid the world of any evidence that this guy ever did this. The truck will be here in a little bit, so why don't we just start dismantling this playground from hell? And we got to work. We took apart the equipment little by little. There were 2 slides, a set of monkey bars, a teeter-totter, and a roundabout that squealed like a pig when it spun. A hopscotch path was barely visible on the floor, drawn in blue marker. There was also an empty pedestal in the middle of the playground. It was just a foot high or so. It looked familiar to me, but couldn't place exactly what it was. Maybe it had been a display stand at one of the stores in the mall. We each focused on a different piece of equipment. It felt like a form of torture. You can't exactly avert your eyes as you're safely taking apart heavy equipment and dragging it away. And after a while, the rust on the metal playground equipment started to look to me like bloodstains. Flecks of rust dislodging from the metal with soft swishing sounds as I unscrewed the bolts that held the equipment together. It was like the teeter-totter was bleeding as I took it apart, like I was killing it. I felt a guilt that I didn't expect to feel as we tore down Tolliver's horrific playground. Maybe it was the rust. Maybe it was the way the old metal and plastic squealed as we separated them from each other and dragged them across the floor on the way to the truck. The sounds echoed through the empty mall like fading, screaming memories. And amid those echoes, I heard a similar but slightly different sound. I put down my tools, stood up, and I cocked my head. I shushed Toby, who was dismantling the slide next to me. He stopped unscrewing, and the mall was eerily quiet for a few moments. It was like we were standing in a painting. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. And then a sob pierced the silence. It was far away and tiny, like it was coming from a rabbit or a baby bird. Toby's eyelids were the only movement. His eyes grew so wide that I could see the whites all the way around his brown irises. I put a finger to my lips to signal to him to remain silent. Annabelle and Frank stomped their way back out of Cole's and into the atrium. They had just dragged something out to the truck. I turned my shushing finger to them, as did Toby. Annabelle and Frank stopped dead in their tracks like they were under arrest. And then the sob sounded again. It was still barely audible, and the empty mall threw the sound around like a coin in an empty pocket. It was impossible to know where the cries were coming from. After a few moments of whispering, we decided to split up and go our different ways through the mall. If someone found something, they would call or text the rest of the group. I felt like one of Pac-Man ghosts as we all glided quietly in our different directions through the empty corridors of the mall. The black gaping mouths of the vacant storefronts were wrenched open in permanent silent screams all around me. The hallway I chose was equally as silent. I knew almost equally that the sound, whatever it was not coming from the direction I was going. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Frank. I picked up. "I think it's coming from Zales," Frank said. "It's coming from the vault." "Oh, Jesus, Kyle, it sounds like the little kid's crying in there." I told him I was coming. I spun on my heel, sending a squeak echoing down the hall that sounded a lot like a whole orchestra of violins playing a shrill note. I ran as quickly as I could in the direction Frank had gone. Annabelle and Toby were right behind me, hustling back from their hallways. Toby wielded a crowbar and Annabelle had a hammer. By the time we got to the jewelry store, we were all panting. For some reason, the store was still accessible. Most of the other storefronts had gates pulled down over their entryways, but not Zales. Frank was behind the counter and waved for us to follow him. His eyes were wet with tears. "Now there's somebody in there," Frank said. "Oh, God help me, it sounds like a kid." I had mostly caught my breath, so I could finally hear something other than my pants and my heartbeat thudding in my ears. It did sound like a kid was behind the large, slate-colored vault door. "I called out a few times," Frank said, "to see if they could hear me or speak back to me, but hell, they just kept crying. There's no words." I went up to the door and tried the handle. It was locked, of course, but I thought I'd give it a try anyway. I leaned my ear against the cold metal door. It was hard to figure out whether it was a boy or a girl, and each time they cried, it sounded like a different voice. There was a little pin pad on the wall with a full keyboard that I assumed was for unlocking the vault. I couldn't even begin to think of what the passcode might be. Toby stepped up and inserted the crowbar into the crack in the vault door. I stepped back as Annabelle strode forward, hammer in hand. She drove the crowbar as far into the crack as it would go, and Toby put his full weight into prying the door open. But it didn't work. They bent the metal a little bit, but couldn't make any meaningful progress. "We're gonna have to call somebody in," Frank said. "Maybe we could track down one of the former owners or employees who might remember the code." I stepped back into the hallway. My vision swam with tears, and I put a hand over my mouth to hold in what was either a scream or a sob that was climbing up my throat. I looked back toward the playground, and in my wavy vision, I swear I saw a figure standing in the middle of the corridor. I blinked, and it was gone. I turned back to face the jewelry store and saw Toby wiping sweat from his ruddy face. That poor kid inside the vault. I don't remember hearing anything about a missing child, but admittedly, I hadn't been reading a ton of the news around the situation. I just couldn't stomach it. This child was so alone, so forlorn. Their parents were somewhere still wishing for their kid to come home. Even though the others, like Angela, were nearly catatonic, at least they were home. At least they were away from this cursed place. Maybe all they could say was playtime, but at least they... My mind cleared. Playtime. Fuck me. That was it. I ran back into the store and went straight to the keypad on the wall, and I typed in playtime. There was a long, loud beep. Then the lock on the door clicked. Toby grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. A sickly sweet smell like fresh mud came from out of the vault. One final sob drifted through the air, sounding more like a sigh. We stepped into the doorway to see a pale figure standing in there. It was a mannequin. It wore blue jeans and a white t-shirt with a yellow smiley face on it. On its face, someone had drawn a wide red smile and 2 blue eyes. The 4 of us stood in the doorway, as still and as silent as the mannequin in front of us. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw it was my sister, Morgan. I picked it up. Angela had apparently snapped out of her stupor a few seconds earlier. Morgan was crying tears of joy on the other end, and I heard Angela saying something loudly and happily in the background. "She wants to say something to you," Morgan said. There was a rustling as Morgan passed the phone to Angela. "Thank you, Uncle Kyle," Angela said. "You found it." Now, I don't think I'm quite smart enough to understand, and it barely makes sense anyway, but here's what I come to think over the past couple of weeks. Angela told me that the empty pedestal in the middle of the playground had once held that mannequin. When they were brought into the mall, Tolliver told them the mannequin was Grinning Greg and that he was the mascot of the theme park. Tolliver made up some song about Grinning Greg and had the children sing it. Each night before they were locked in one of the stores to sleep, the children were forced to dance around Grinning Greg and sing the song. One by one, the kids slipped into a catatonic state. Tolliver had to strap them into their seats on the playground equipment once they got to that point. And Angela told me that she was one of the last ones to fade away, as she put it. She said Grinning Greg's smile got wider each time a child faded away. Angela faded away at some point, but before she did, she said that Grinning Greg spoke to her. He said to always remember playtime. Angela repeated playtime to herself over and over until she faded away. Now, at some point before the police came to the mall, Tolliver must have hidden the mannequin in that vault, or maybe there was something more supernatural at play. Maybe Grinning Greg walked off on his own. But like I said, I'm not smart enough to understand, or I'm too narrow-minded to fully comprehend. All I know is this, that Angela's better now. Still traumatized and scared, but at least she's speaking and smiling and getting back to normal. We did what Morgan asked me to do. We cleaned up what that man did in that mall. The other cleaners and I finished our work that day while the police came and examined the mannequin. They took him away and I have no idea what they did with him. There's a part of me that doesn't want to know. What I do know is that we cleaned up that atrium and shipped the whole playground off to the dump. I hope they melted all that shit down. And I pray that instead of the kids fading away, Irwin B. Tolliver fades away to nothing, like a scream in an empty mall.